All right, serial killers. It's a world that I think kind of fascinates everyone a little bit, but also terrifies us, right?
Definitely.
I mean, we've all seen the movies, the documentaries, listened to the podcasts,
Oh, yeah.
but how much of that is like actually real?
Yeah. That's the big question, isn't it?
That's what we're going to try and figure out today, right here. We've got some really interesting stuff to dig into.
Yeah, we've got some hard data to look at.
We do. We've got some stats from the Office of Justice programs. Those are always fun.
A bit dry, maybe, but crucial.
Yeah. And then a book, Serial Killers? The Method and Madness of Monsters. Pretty intense title.
Definitely sets the tone.
And then, to keep things, lively, we'll be pulling some cases from the Serial Killers podcast on Spotify. They do some amazing deep dives on individual killers.
Oh, yeah, that's one of my go-to podcasts. They always find the most fascinating cases.
So we're basically going to be comparing, like, the pop culture view of serial killers
Right.
to what the facts actually tell us.
Exactly. Separating the Hollywood hype from the reality.
So first things first, gotta start with the definition. What actually makes someone a serial killer?
Right, because it's not just any killer, right? There's got to be something more to it.
Yeah, like what sets them apart?
Hunting Humans, an encyclopedia of modern serial killers. That's a great resource, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty clear on the definition. You've got to have 2 or more separate murders.
Okay, so multiple murders. That makes sense.
But there's got to be a motive linking them.
Ah, so it's not just random, it's like a pattern.
Exactly. And often, the victims themselves will share some kind of characteristic.
So it's like they fit a certain profile that the killer is drawn to.
You got it. And here's where it gets really interesting. We always think of serial killers as these lone wolves, right?
Yeah, like working totally alone.
But about 10% of them actually commit their crimes in pairs or even groups.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. It's like a real-life Bonnie and Clyde situation, but way darker.
Whoa. I never even considered that. So are there any, like, well-known examples of that?
Oh, for sure. The Serial Killers podcast, the one we mentioned, they actually did a whole episode on Catherine and Machine Gun Kelly.
Those names ring a bell.
They were operating back in the 1930s, a true killer couple.
Wow, that just goes to show you how many different forms this whole thing can take.
Absolutely. It's not as straightforward as we might think.
Okay, so now I'm curious about, like, the hard numbers, the demographics of who these people actually are.
Right. Let's get into some stats.
Hunting Humans breaks down some pretty interesting stuff, and honestly, I was a little surprised by some of it.
Oh, yeah, it definitely challenges some of those preconceived notions we have.
So get this, 74% of serial killers are from the U.S.
That's a huge majority.
Right. And then if we zoom in on American serial killers, it gets even more specific. 85% are male and 82% are white.
That paints a very particular picture.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, is this just how it is, or is, like, the media's portrayal of serial killers skewing our perceptions?
That's a great question. It's like a chicken and egg situation, right? Do those portrayals shape how we see things, or are they simply reflecting a trend that already exists?
Right.
Yeah.
Something to think about for sure.
Definitely makes you wonder.
Okay, so we've got a sense of who they are, at least statistically. But now the big question, why?
Yeah, what makes someone cross that line?
What turns a person into a serial killer?
Well, if hunting humans is anything to go by, it's rarely simple. It's almost never just one thing.
Like, there's no single serial killer gene or something.
Right, there's this whole twisted psychology at play. Often it involves a real desire for power, maybe even like a fascination with death itself.
Yeah, you always hear about that in those true crime shows. Like, they dig into the killer's psyche, trying to find the root of it all.
Right, they try to find that one key to unlocking their motive.
Exactly.
It's definitely a popular theme, but the reality is, it's rarely that straightforward. There's rarely a single aha moment that explains everything. It's usually a whole bunch of factors.
Yeah, it's probably way more complex than the movies make it seem.
Oh, absolutely. Much more nuanced.
Okay, so we talked about power, but there are other motives too, right?
Yeah. Hunting Humans mentions a bunch, like sadosexual motives, the need for control, sometimes even just plain old greed.
Oh, wow. So it really can be all over the map.
It can. And there was one more detail from the encyclopedia that just, I don't know, it kind of stuck with me.
What's that?
It mentions cases involving Satanism. And even some where medical professionals ended up becoming serial killers.
Whoa, talk about unexpected twists. It just goes to show you can't really predict this stuff.
Nope. You can't put them all in a neat little box and say, this is what makes a serial killer.
Right. So we've got a working definition. We've touched on those super complex motivations. But have serial killers always been around? Or is this a more modern thing?
Serial killers. The Method and Madness of Monsters, the book we mentioned. That one actually traces it all the way back to ancient Rome.
Wow, seriously. So this isn't just a product of, like, modern times.
Nope. It's been going on for centuries, like a dark thread woven through human history.
That's kind of a chilling thought. Serial killers aren't just a modern-day boogeyman. They've been around forever.
Pretty much, yeah. What I found really fascinating was the book's discussion of postmodernity and how it might relate to what at least seems like a rise in serial killings.
Postmodernity. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure. Basically, it's this idea that around the mid-1960s, there was a big shift in cultural values and structures.
Okay.
And the book argues that this created a kind of breeding ground for serial killers. So, like, think about the explosion of mass media, the growing focus on individualism, maybe even a desensitization to violence.
Yeah, I can see how those things might play a role.
All these factors, the book argues, might have contributed to that increase in serial killings we saw in the late 20th century.
So it's not just about the individual psychology, it's also the world they're operating in.
Exactly. It's this interplay between the individual and the larger cultural forces. And there's even a suggestion in the book that the way certain groups are dehumanized in the media and society, it could actually make them targets for serial killers.
Oh, wow. That's a scary thought. So if these societal shifts are part of the problem, could it happen again? Are we heading for like a postmodernity where we see another wave of serial killers?
Now, that's a question worth exploring. But before we get too ahead of ourselves,
Right.
we need to look at how law enforcement actually tries to, understand and catch these people.
That's a good point. Catching a serial killer is a whole different ballgame compared to like your average investigation.
Absolutely. Serial killers.
Hmm.
The Method and Madness of Monsters goes deep into the different profiling systems they use to try and solve these cases.
Profiling, huh? So that's not just a Hollywood thing.
No, it's very real. Though, of course, it's more complicated than the movies make it seem. The book talks about the FBI's crime scene analysis approach, the British psychological profiling method, and even the Canadian way, which focuses on geographic profiling.
You know, that reminds me of the show Mindhunter on Netflix.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I saw it was listed as a frequently bought item alongside the book on Amazon. Have you seen it? It kind of gives you a peek into the world of criminal profiling, but obviously it's dramatized for TV.
Yeah, I've seen it. Definitely a fascinating watch. It's good for getting a basic understanding, but it's important to remember that profiling, even though it's a valuable tool, isn't soul-proof. There have been successes, for sure, but there have also been some pretty big missteps along the way.
So how effective are these profiling methods in real life? Does the book go into that at all?
It does. And it basically says that it's a mixed bag. Some cases are cracked wide open thanks to profiling, but in other cases, it sends the investigators down the wrong path entirely. It's a constantly evolving field. Welcome back to our deep dive into serial killers.
Yeah, we've talked about like the big picture stuff.
The definitions and the trends and all that.
But now we got to get down to the nitty-gritty, right?
Into the real-life cases.
Because it's one thing to talk about theories, but it's a whole other thing to see how it all plays out in the real world.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's get into some of those real-life examples that really bring it home.
Okay, so remember that killer couple from the 1930s?
Catherine and Machine Gun Kelly.
Those two, yeah.
Oh, yeah, those guys.
Serial Killers, the podcast, did a whole episode on them.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you, it's a wild ride.
I bet.
They were like straight out of the criminal underworld back in the day.
Yeah, they didn't really fit the mold, did they?
No, not at all.
Like, weren't they more like gangsters than, typical serial killers?
Yeah, that's a good point.
What were they all about, anyway?
It seems like their whole thing was about greed and ambition, more than any kind of, psychological need.
Like, they were just in it for the money and the power.
Pretty much, yeah.
So they were robbing banks, kidnapping people for ransom, and taking out anyone who got in their way.
Exactly.
So, I mean, they technically fit the definition of serial killers with the multiple murders and all.
They do, yeah.
But it wasn't about fulfilling some dark fantasy or anything.
Yeah.
It was just a means to an end.
Yeah, just part of their criminal lifestyle.
So that really shows you how different these motives can be, right?
It does, yeah.
You've got everything from, cold-hearted ambition
Right.
to really messed up psychological stuff.
A whole spectrum, yeah.
Okay, so we've got that end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any cases that really highlight the darker side of things?
The more psychological stuff,
Hmm.
one that comes to mind, and it's one that the Serial Killers podcast really digs into, is Israel Keys.
Oh, man, Israel Keys.
Yeah, he's,
His name just sends chills down your spine.
doesn't it?
He was like the epitome of calculated evil.
Absolutely.
What was it about him that was so, so creepy?
It was almost like he was playing a game with the authorities.
Yeah, like he was always one step ahead.
Hmm.
It seemed like his crimes were totally random.
They were hard to pin down, that's for sure.
He didn't have a specific type of victim.
Nope.
He traveled all over the place.
Yeah, he was constantly on the move.
And he planned everything so meticulously.
It was chilling how much thought he put into it.
I remember listening to that episode and just like, I was blown away by how premeditated it all was.
Yeah, it's all about control.
Not some like sudden urge or anything.
Whoa.
It was all about power and domination.
Exactly.
So his case really shows you how tough it can be to, profile these guys
Yeah, it's not a perfect science.
and then to actually catch them.
It's like trying to catch a ghost,
He was like a phantom.
drifting across the country, leaving a trail of victims behind him.
Yeah, and it wasn't until he made this like really small mistake
One tiny slip up.
that they were finally able to nab him.
It's amazing how these things work out sometimes.
So, I mean, profiling can be helpful,
Definitely a useful tool.
but it's not a guarantee.
No, not at all.
Especially with guys like Keys, who are
Definitely.
so smart and so careful.
Yeah, they're a real challenge.
Okay, so we've talked about serial killers who crave power,
Mhm.
control,
Right.
even those fascinated with death.
Yeah.
But what about those cases where the motive is even more disturbing? Like where it's rooted in some twisted ideology?
Oh, that's a whole other level of darkness.
Yeah, where their actions are justified by some belief system.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is.
But unfortunately, it's a reality.
Yeah, and that brings us to a whole other category of serial killers. The ones fueled by hatred.
Right. The ones who target their victims based on, like, race, religion, sexual orientation, things like that.
It's like they're on a mission to eliminate anyone who doesn't fit their worldview.
It's terrifying, really.
There's this line in Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, that really stuck with me.
What was it?
It says modern culture, media, and society degrade certain classes of people in the perception of homicidal psychopaths who serially target and murder them in an attempt to satisfy increasingly addictive sexual hedonistic fantasies.
Wow.
Heavy stuff.
It is, yeah.
It's like, it's saying that our society, the way we portray certain groups, it can actually contribute to this kind of violence.
That's a really disturbing thought.
It is.
Yeah, those marginalized groups become invisible.
Or even worse, they're seen as less than human.
And that can have some really, really devastating consequences.
We've talked about some pretty dark stuff today.
We have.
Killer couples, the twisted psychology behind all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But before we wrap up this part, I want to shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about something a little more, well, maybe not hopeful, but
Hopeful in the context of serial killers.
I know, it's a bit of a stretch.
It's not the first word that comes to mind.
But what about the stories of survival? The people who encountered these monsters.
Right, and live to tell the tale.
Exactly.
Those stories are so important.
They are.
They remind us that even in the face of, like, pure evil,
Yeah.
there's still strength and resilience
And
and the
resilience.
will to survive.
And I bet they also give us some real insight into, what can help someone escape a dangerous situation.
You're absolutely right.
So in the last part of our deep dive, let's explore those stories.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's hear from the people who faced their worst nightmares and came out on the other side.
I'm all for that.
Because in the end, understanding how to protect ourselves, that's got to be one of the most valuable takeaways from all of this. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into serial killers. And, we've spent a lot of time in some pretty dark places.
Yeah, it's been heavy.
But now I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about the people who encountered this evil and actually lived to tell the tale.
The survivors.
Yeah. Their stories, I think, are really important.
Absolutely. They show us that, even when faced with something so horrific, there's still hope.
There's resilience, there's strength.
And they also teach us a lot about what it takes to survive an encounter like that.
Yeah. And serial killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, the book we've been talking about, it actually dedicates a whole section to survival strategies.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not just like theoretical stuff. They've pulled in FBI studies. They've even got interviews with, get this, both serial killers and
Wow,
survivors.
that's a unique perspective.
Right. So it's like by understanding how these killers think, how they pick their victims, what they look for, maybe we can figure out how to better protect ourselves.
Yeah, it's like studying a predator to figure out how to avoid becoming prey.
Exactly. So what do we learn from these survivors? What are the key takeaways?
One thing that pops up over and over again, it's trusting your gut.
Like your intuition.
Yeah, a lot of survivors talk about this feeling they had, like a little voice saying, something's not right here.
That feeling of unease.
Exactly. But they ignored it. And, things went bad. So we got to learn to pay attention to those signals.
Yeah, there's that saying, if it feels wrong, it probably is. But how do you, like, balance that with not being paranoid all the time? I mean, not every stranger is a serial killer.
Right. It's about finding that middle ground between being aware of your surroundings, especially in risky situations, and not letting fear take over your life.
So, like, being cautious but not letting it rule you.
Exactly. Like being aware of who's around when you're walking alone at night. Or if someone gives you a bad vibe, even in a social setting, trusting that feeling and getting out of there.
So it's about being present, not distracted, and really tuning into those internal alarms.
You got it.
Okay, awareness, intuition, got it. But what if, like, despite all that, you still find yourself in a dangerous situation? Are there, like, specific things you can do?
Yeah, and this is where serial killers, the method and madness of monsters, gets really practical. It stresses how important it is to fight back.
Really? Even if someone's trying to, like, abduct you?
Especially then. See, a lot of times, these guys, they rely on the element of surprise and on the victim just going along with it.
And, like, they freeze up or something.
Right. But if you resist, even if it means you might get hurt, it throws them off. It gives
Right.
you a chance to escape.
That's interesting, because you always hear, like, don't fight back against a kidnapper.
Yeah, but think about it. You become a much harder target if you fight back. And the book makes a really important point. Don't let them take you to a second location.
Oh, because once you're out of sight.
It's much worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, fighting back right at the start, even if it seems impossible, it could be the difference between life and death.
So what are some ways to do that, to resist, especially if you're caught off guard?
The book suggests going for vulnerable spots, like the eyes, the throat, the groin. Even just a well-placed kick or scratch can give you a chance to break free. And never underestimate the power of making noise. Yelling, screaming, anything to attract attention. It might deter the attacker or alert someone who can help.
So it's all about making yourself more trouble than you're worth.
Exactly. And even if you're not like physically strong, you can still be mentally tough. Never give up, keep fighting, and keep looking for that chance to get away.
We've talked about how some groups are more vulnerable to becoming victims. And, the book suggests that modern culture and the media, they kind of play a role in that.
Yeah, by dehumanizing certain
Well,
groups.
right? And that's a really disturbing thought.
It is. It's like when certain groups are pushed to the margins of society, when they're stereotyped, it creates this environment where violence against them becomes more acceptable.
Like it's almost expected, or at least not as shocking.
And that's really dangerous. It's not just about, those obvious hate crimes. It's about the way prejudice and discrimination can kind of seep into everything and create a climate where violence is, if not encouraged, at least tolerated.
So it's like a call to action for all of us to, really confront those biases head on, to speak out against injustice, to work toward a society where everyone is valued and respected.
Exactly. Because ultimately, the fight against serial killers, it's not just about catching individuals. It's about addressing the root causes of violence in all its forms.
We've covered some really dark stuff today, the motivations, the methods, the psychology of these truly terrifying people. But we've also seen that there's hope.
Right. There's the courage of the survivors, the amazing work that law enforcement does to stop these guys, and, our own ongoing efforts to understand this phenomenon and prevent it from happening.
So yeah, the world of serial killers, it can be kind of morbidly fascinating, but there are really important lessons to be learned.
Definitely. Lessons about being aware, about being resilient, and about the importance of fighting those societal biases that can lead to violence.
So if you're interested in learning more about any of this stuff, I really recommend checking out the sources we talked about today.
Yeah, Hunting Humans, an encyclopedia of modern serial killers.
Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters.
And of course, the Serial Killers podcasts. They're all really great resources.
Knowledge is power. The more we understand about this stuff, the better we can protect ourselves and each other. All right, that's going to wrap it up for today's deep dive into serial killers. Stay safe out there, everyone.